For a few minutes now he'd been pondering the question on the pamphlet he held in his hands. The question was, has the revival of the arts and sciences done more to corrupt or purify morals? Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 38 years old, had been thinking about both sides of this issue as he traveled through France on his way to visit a friend in prison. That friend, the famous philosopher and writer Denis Diderot, had gotten himself into trouble with some radical new ideas that defied conventional religion. The year was 1750. It was a time when most new ideas, whether religious, political, or philosophical, could land a man in jail, in exile, or even worse. The question about the effect of arts and sciences that Rousseau pondered that day was an essay competition being held by the Academy of Dijon. Rousseau thought he might like to enter, but of course he would first have to come up with an answer to the question, and there were so many different ways to look at the subject. While thinking about it, suddenly he began to feel strange, as if taken over by a force of some kind. Then, like a lightning bolt, he had a sudden revelation of the answer to the question. As the answer came to him, that science and art had corrupted humankind, and why, he found he could barely breathe. While he was still panting and struggling for breath, his legs went weak, and he found he could no longer walk or even stand. Rousseau collapsed under a tree, feeling as if all his life energy had been drained from him. Then he began to weep. The weeping became uncontrollable. He didn't know why he wept. He only knew he couldn't stop it. After some time, when he was able to regain his composure, and when his breathing was normal again, Rousseau rose to his feet and continued on his journey. His whole life he was never able to understand what had happened to him that day, as he meditated on the question of human morality. But the experience would change his life and propel him on his career as one of the greatest writer-philosophers of all time. Rousseau's influence on his age, and on the age that followed, was probably greater than any other single writer, and his ideas profoundly affected the course of history, especially in France and Europe. The ideas Rousseau proposed were so new and catalytic that he's often considered the father of the modern nation and the father of the French Revolution, for he laid the ideological groundwork for the patriots who ousted King Louis XVI and ushered in the French Republic. But this didn't happen until 20 years after the release of his most famous book, The Social Contract. Rousseau's unconventional approach to politics aroused such controversy that he was eventually driven out of France and forced to live in exile. The revolution in his homeland, which some might consider the culmination of his ideas and labors, didn't occur until 11 years after his death. The ideas of all great philosophers are always open to interpretation, but this is uncommonly true in the case of Rousseau. For the ideas he put forth in The Social Contract and his other works would remarkably be used in later times to support both democratic and totalitarian governments. The despot, the Democrat, the conservative, the liberal, and even the communist could quote Rousseau to justify their means and ends. Everybody seemed to be able to claim him for their own side. Appropriately enough, Rousseau's personal life was also filled with contradictions and shifts in philosophy. There were times his point of view rotated a full 180 degrees. Still, these changes didn't prevent his work from having a profound effect on social and political thinkers of the time. We can understand why if we consider the philosophy of those times, and how he helped spin them in a new direction. Rousseau lived in what is historically known as the Age of Reason, or the Age of Enlightenment, a term applied to 18th century Europe in general, and which reflects the social and political conditions of the period. He was typical of the Age of Reason in some ways. In other ways, he clearly wasn't. To get a clear perspective on this age and Rousseau's place in it, you'll need a little historical background. In the 17th century, which preceded the Age of Reason, or Enlightenment, the prominent political theories came out of England. In the 18th century, they shifted to the European continent. In the 17th century, the writers who had the most impact on political thought were the British philosophers Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Under their intellectual guidance, Britain was shifting to a parliamentary government. But while Britain underwent this gradual transformation, in France the government was still under the control of a dynasty, the Bourbon dynasty, best symbolized by King Louis XIV, who ruled from 1661 through 1715. Power was based on aristocratic privilege, an established church, and a highly centralized government of the few. This government was basically indifferent to the peasants and to the emerging middle class. Political theory in France was dormant at this time. No important theories had been proposed for 100 years, and the last one had been a doctrine that conveniently defended absolute monarchy. The French monarchy, unlike that of England, was rigid and repressive. It resisted any attempts at reform and thereby laid the foundations for what was an inevitable revolution. In this atmosphere of intolerance would be born the radical forces that eventually shattered the existing order of France and all of Europe. In the 18th century, certain French thinkers began to take inspiration from England. Important figures in the French Enlightenment, such as Voltaire, visited England and returned to France, anxious to introduce the ideas of Locke and Sir Isaac Newton. Locke's basic theory was the natural rights of man, which he felt were based in reason and deduced from natural law. Based upon reason, all men were born free and possessed the right to determine their form of government. Man's right to liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness were incompatible with the idea of a monarchy that rules by divine law. It was Locke, not Rousseau, who introduced the idea of a social contract, even though that's the title of Rousseau's greatest work. To Locke, this contract occurred when people voluntarily surrendered certain powers to the state in exchange for peace and security, and he maintained the right to revoke the government when violations of the contract occurred. Locke supplied the necessary grounds for political and social change to Voltaire in France, and also to Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin in America. From Isaac Newton, French philosophers found a new view of the world that held it was regulated by universal laws, to which God was also obedient. People had only to master these laws through reason to understand God and reality. One of these natural laws was gravity, and just as gravity worked on falling objects in the physical world, so did it work on social and political institutions. All of this now brings us to the Age of Reason or Enlightenment, which covered the 18th century and developed from the ideas of these British and French philosophers. In summary, this age was marked by a new attitude that sought to free philosophy and religion from the superstitions and traditions of the past by the use of reason and science as the foundation of all belief and behavior. Inevitably, this new attitude resulted in criticism of existing social and political orders, which represented tradition and superstition of the past. It was an attitude that was absorbed at almost every level of society, even at the top. At the top were the men who became known as the enlightened despots. They included Charles III of Spain, Joseph II of Austria, and Frederick the Great of Prussia, who brought men of science and literature to their courts and supported new learning in their cultures. They made attempts to rule by reason rather than divine right, and accepted some criticism of the existing political order, but in the long run, they put little effort into real reform. Meanwhile, there emerged in the upper middle class of Europe a group of writers, philosophers, scientists, and statesmen who took on the views of the Age of Reason and engaged in active criticism of their political and social systems. The most impressive of these were Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau. They introduced a more rational approach to European society than had been seen in any previous age. The most important ideas behind this movement were the following. 1. A belief in God based upon reason and nature. Religion had to be made sensible and rational. Revelations, miracles, and other Christian dogma had to be re-examined. It was the laws of Newton and of science and nature, and not biblical scripture, that would lead to an understanding of God. 2. A return to classical thought and the principles of Greek and Roman literature, particularly Aristotle. These principles focused on form, structure, discipline, and emotional restraint. Even the music of the Age of Reason reflects the classical influence. During this age, Mozart and Haydn developed the rules and structure of the modern symphony and concerto. 3. The idea of the natural rights of man, based chiefly on the idea of natural law, which can be traced back to Plato and Aristotle. There was a higher ultimate law upon which all earthly law should be based. This idea would be proclaimed openly in the Declaration on the Rights of Man that came out of the French Revolution. 4. Finally is the concept of the social contract, which had existed for a century before the Age of Reason. It held that man once lived in a natural state, free of government and state control, and he gave up that state in exchange for the benefits of peace and security that an organized government could offer. This is the concept that was so broad it was widely and variously interpreted, providing arguments for the monarch and the tyrant, as well as for the democrat and the revolutionary. According to Locke's influential writing, this contract could be revoked by revolution if the government failed to meet its end of the bargain. None of these 4 ideas harmonized with the idea of a government based on inherited privilege and power. So it was within this framework that Rousseau began his search for a new political theory that would redefine his society of 18th century France and Europe. In many ways he reflected the spirit of the times. He was brilliant, intellectual, restless, ruthless, and he challenged the existing order. At the same time, his ideas were quite different from those leading the Age of Enlightenment. For although this age was based on reason and rational thought, Rousseau based his philosophy on the heart rather than the mind. He was more emotional. This is why the next age, which he introduced, is called Romanticism. Perhaps because he was so emotional, Rousseau was also often a man in conflict or opposition to those around him. He had many quarrels, emotional outbursts, and splits from friends and colleagues. There's no doubt that he was a man not just of external conflicts, but of inner conflicts, as the facts of his life will testify. Rousseau was born on June 28, 1712 in Geneva, the son of a watchmaker. His mother died only a few days after his birth, an event he referred to when he later said, "My birth was the first of my misfortunes." He was raised by an aunt and a nanny, but his father's passion for books had an early influence on him. Monsieur Rousseau liked to read his son novels, histories, and the heroic biographies of Plutarch, causing Rousseau to comment later, "I was a Roman before I was 12. This was the only early education Rousseau received, except that he learned by his own initiative. This accounts in part for his later views that rejected formal and traditional education in France. Rousseau's father had failed as a watchmaker, and the family suffered a kind of social downgrading that bothered Rousseau his entire life. When he was 10, his father fought a duel and was forced to flee Geneva. He put Rousseau with a Calvinist minister and later apprenticed him to an engraver. Rousseau liked the work but hated the constraint and the tyranny of his employer. So one day he simply left. He headed out into the world with no formal education, no training, no financial support, and with a temperament so sensitive, unstable, and at times morbid that some have suspected him of insanity. At that time he came into contact with a remarkable woman who had a profound influence on his thoughts and life. She was the Baroness de Warens, a 30-year-old woman whose goal in life was to convert young men to Catholicism. She was a pious woman and also a romantic one, whose religious passion somehow merged with physical passion. Her converts were sometimes also her lovers, as would be the fate of Rousseau, but not for some time yet. First, the Baroness sent him to Turin, where he was supposed to denounce his Protestant faith and lodge in a Catholic hospice. There he was obliged to become a servant, an experience which suited him not in the least. There's a famous incident that happened around this time in Rousseau's life, a minor one, but one his opponents after his death liked to use to point out the dangers of relying on one's feelings being what Rousseau maintained were so important. His employer found a ribbon in Rousseau's possessions, which he had clearly stolen from the house. When confronted with it, Rousseau claimed it was given to him by a maid, and although this wasn't true, the maid was punished for the theft. When Rousseau wrote of this incident in his biography, he showed no remorse. He simply said instead that the maid's name had been the first to come to his mind, because he had so much affection for her. His excuse for lying was therefore that it hadn't been done with malice. Rousseau never liked being under the command of anyone else, so he returned to Madame de Warens the following year, and this time she took him into her own home. She arranged for him to have music lessons, a rather important event in his life since it later became his chief means of support. He worked as a music copyist and music teacher. For years, Rousseau was unable to decide between a career in music or literature. Madame de Warens also gave him access to her enormous library of books and introduced him to the genteel, sophisticated life of the French aristocracy. Rousseau would periodically wander off in search of work or identity, but he always returned to Madame de Warens. In his travels through France, he saw firsthand the self-indulgence and decadence associated with the upper class. When he was 20, Rousseau and Madame de Warens began a love affair that lasted 6 years and ended when Rousseau discovered she'd taken another lover. During that time, he considered entering the priesthood or taking up a career as a choir master. He left the de Warens' house when the affair ended and shortly after decided to pursue a career in writing, a decision which prompted his move to Paris. While he tried to figure out what to write and how to write it, he supported himself with music copying and music lessons. When that failed to bring in a sufficient income, he became private secretary to yet another benefactress, Madame Dupin, wife of a rich farmer. Through her contacts, he secured, in 1741, a job as secretary to the French ambassador in Venice. It was here that he was first introduced to the practical problems of government and politics. But once again, Rousseau found it impossible to work under another's authority and felt exploited. He also disliked Venice, which he felt lacked nature, although he did develop a passion for opera there. More importantly, his observations of the Republican city-state of Venice, which he found inferior to that of Geneva, prompted him to start writing what he himself regarded as his most important book, Institutions Politiques. After Venice, Rousseau ventured back to Paris, where he established an important friendship with Denis Diderot, a leading proponent of the doctrine of reason. In Paris, Rousseau first made his mark on the world of music. He invented a new system of musical notation that won him acclaim, published a well-received dissertation on modern music, and composed operas and ballets in the Italian style. He always argued that Italian music was superior to French music because it was freer in style. He had the opportunity to receive a royal pension, but the conflict between his contempt for the monarchy and his need for money finally led him to refuse the offer. While this was going on, his friend Diderot edited the most significant literary project of 18th century France, the great Encyclopedia, which included contributions from all the leading French intellectuals, or philosophes as they were called. In the introduction to this volume, Diderot described his aim this way: to gather all knowledge together, so that our descendants, being better instructed, may become at the same time happier and more virtuous. Rousseau was a contributor, writing first on music and then on other topics. Diderot's work on the Encyclopedia reflected his atheistic leanings, and he was imprisoned for his efforts in 1749. It was on his way to visit Diderot that Rousseau ran across the pamphlet about the writing competition in Dijon, and had his mystical experience under the tree. When he told Diderot of his experience, his friend encouraged him to enter the competition and to uphold his opinion that the arts and sciences had corrupted man. Even though Diderot disagreed with his opinion, he thought such an unfashionable belief would distinguish Rousseau from his competitors. Diderot was right. Rousseau won the competition, and from then on was a famous man. Rousseau had now worked out a philosophy that separated him not only from the majority view, but from the other philosophers and intellectuals of the Enlightenment. To begin with, in his essay he maintained that science was not saving us, as the Age of Reason would maintain, but that it was bringing moral ruin. Progress was illusionary. What appeared to be advancement was really retrogression. It neither made man happier nor more virtuous. Secondly, the arts were used, in his words, just to cast garlands of flowers over the chains men bore. It was in rural life, untouched by progress and the corruption of scientific advancement, that men were most pure and virtuous. In this essay was born the concept of primitive man, or the noble savage, that's so often associated with Rousseau. This anti-intellectualism separated him from other philosophers in the Age of Reason and was the forerunner of the Romanticism of the 19th century. After he won his essay contest, Rousseau was a celebrity who was courted by all the fashionable people of Paris and invited to entertain them in the popular salons where current thought and trends were the subject of long, animated conversations among intellectuals and aristocrats. His praise of the natural or primitive man became a fad among the aristocracy. Even Marie Antoinette sought out the rustic life, dressing as a peasant and milking cows on the palatial grounds of Versailles. Although Diderot and other philosophes relished this social success and blended well with the upper class, Rousseau did not. He enjoyed the fame, but he lacked the social training and background, and always felt uncomfortable in such settings. Finally, he refused to join the circle of Parisian literary celebrities and began to live what he called a life of solitude. He began a systematic assault on the Enlightenment that alienated him from other philosophers, including his friend Diderot. Around this time, Rousseau published a second essay entitled A Discourse on the Origins of Inequality, in which he elaborated on the same theme of his first essay. Then, when he was 44, he decided it was time to live his own principles. He resolved to try firsthand the simple life of the primitive, and moved to a small cottage in the country, where he adopted an ascetic lifestyle and broke with all of his former friends. In the country, Rousseau formed a union with an unusually ignorant and plain laundry-maid named Therese Levasseur. From then on, she was a permanent part of his household, although he didn't marry her until late in life. Therese bore him 5 children, each one of which was promptly placed in an orphanage, a common practice in those years. His friends attributed his strange attraction to this kitchen girl, who was reportedly quite backwards and intellectually deficient, to his rusticity, his stubborn adherence to the belief that the country was more virtuous than sophisticated society, and that natural man was more moral than modern or urban man. Other less tolerant friends simply felt that life with the dull-witted Therese guaranteed Rousseau a continuing sense of superiority. The 12 years that followed Rousseau's winning of the Essay Prize were his most productive, in spite of the fact that he suffered from constant pain because of a urinary disease and was forced to wear a catheter. In the country, he produced his 3 greatest works, the novels Emile and the New Eloise, and The Social Contract. The theme of Emile was the best way to train a young man from infancy to manhood, and it developed into a major criticism of the existing education system. Rousseau held that man had degenerated from his primordial state of virtue and goodness, and the education system needed to restore these natural virtues. The New Eloise was an attempt to portray the elements of nature in human relationships. Natural man and woman, unburdened by the artificial restraints of civilization, were superior in love, life, and morality to the organized society with its sophistication and decadence. Rousseau said of the book, "I was led to write it by a desire for loving, which I had never been able to satisfy, and by which I felt myself devoured." He also wrote several essays and articles on topics which included criticism of theater, a defense of religious faith, the superiority of the natural style of Italian music over the artificial style of French music, and ideas on art and communication. In 1762, the year he released both Emile and The Social Contract, Rousseau was 50 years old. It was then that his happy idyll in the country came to an abrupt halt. Emile, because it attacked education and conventional society, was condemned by the government, which ordered all copies burned, and the author had to flee from France to avoid arrest. He returned to his birthplace of Geneva, and found he was also a condemned man there, for it seemed he'd managed to offend everyone, Catholics, Protestants, and materialists. This was the beginning of the last unhappy phase of his life, in which, as a victim of political and religious intolerance, he dashed from place to place in search of a refuge. Yet Rousseau himself had always felt a strong impulse to worship God, whose presence he felt most powerfully in nature, especially the mountains and forests untouched by man. He wrote his autobiography, called Confessions, in exile, and then settled in England at the invitation of the famous philosopher David Hume. But he quarreled with Hume and became convinced that British intellectuals were making fun of him. He returned to Paris in 1770 when he was 58, at which time he resumed his old life as a music copyist. The remaining years were uneventful, but filled with inner turmoil. Always emotional and temperamental, now Rousseau became a paranoid, convinced everyone, including his friends, were criticizing and trying to sabotage him. He married Therese after 25 years of cohabitation and retired to a life of self-doubt and personal torment. He felt society had turned its back on him, and he suffered from a sense of personal inadequacy. Rousseau died in 1778 at the age of 66 under mysterious circumstances that suggested to some people that he'd committed suicide. The ideas Rousseau left behind him had only begun to live. They were adopted, modified, expanded, and glorified as different philosophers and activists used them to suit their own beliefs and goals. Rousseau's most important work is The Social Contract, written when he was 50. Its themes were chiefly liberty and virtue. It's the argument of the whole book that once mankind enters into society, freedom becomes inseparable from virtue. In this work, Rousseau stated that what's important is a sense of community, of political obligation, and duty to organize society. It was in many ways a reversal of his earlier statements that the primitive man, or the noble savage, was the ideal man. Now the social man is the moral man, and the natural man is the immoral man. Now primitive individualism gives way to complex collectivism. And now, instead of a conflict between liberty and authority, there's an attempt to balance the two. The work marked the pinnacle of his career. Rousseau begins The Social Contract with the famous line, "Man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains." With that comment, he begins his search for a legitimate political organization for humankind, one that retains the best instincts people had in nature, but offers the security and other benefits that only political organization can give. It's a search for a legitimate contract between the people and authority. The contract he seeks must, in his words, be a form of association, which will defend and protect with the whole common force the person and goods of each associate, and in which each, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone, and remain as free as before. But of course the philosophy behind these details, and the way he approached them, is the driving force that eventually brought historical and lasting change to France and Europe and earned him the dual titles of Father of the French Revolution and Father of Modern Nationalism. The nationalism of the modern nation-state system can be traced in large part to Rousseau's emphasis upon the people collectively. Before that time, people's loyalties were limited to the province, the town, the region, the monarchy, or the religion. Rousseau introduced the idea, based on Greek thought, that people have a unity of interest and a duty to a higher level, the level of the nation. The French Revolution was the birth of modern nationalism, and so Rousseau became the intellectual father of both the Revolution and nationalism. Rousseau's purpose in writing The Social Contract was to construct a new political system and to develop a sense of community based upon the consent of all. This is what led him to the concept of the general will, which he held to be supreme over the rights of the individual, so that these could be sacrificed, if need be, for the benefit of all. The general will is his most important and unifying idea, and it's the one that inspired the French revolutionaries. It involves the dominance of the people by the legislature at the expense of the executive branches of government. From this idea of nation and community, the latter years of the Enlightenment gave birth to a concrete reality of nationalism. The idea of a people united under their own power, a power that must prevail, spread quickly. It was a force that took different forms in each emerging nation, and which was later interpreted to apply to dictatorship and fascism, as well as democracy, republicanism, and communism. Rousseau once remarked of his days in Venice that, "I had come to see that in the last resort everything depends on politics, and that whatever men may do, no nation will ever be anything but what the nature of its government may make it." The Social Contract was his attempt to find a political structure that would assure that what the government made of its nation was a just and fair society in which men could experience their fullest freedom while living under a self-imposed authority that also assured their security and betterment. It's an ideal that societies have struggled to attain ever since, and that's given rise to many different governments throughout the world. This is just what Rousseau would have predicted and appreciated, for his most important achievement was his idea that the sort of society and government we live in is really up to us. We are responsible. We make the choices. Those choices should hopefully, because of the inherent nobility of man, lead at some point to the ideal.